Okay, thank you so much. And thank you for the introduction and for all that background information, which is very helpful. It really is an honor to be invited to speak with you. And I want to thank you for showing that lovely photo of me, which was taken before the pandemic. I can't remember dressing up so nicely since then. Things have certainly been interesting. This is a great chance to think about something other than the pandemic for a little while. So thank you for that as well. Let me jump right into it. But before I do, a couple caveats. I bring a perspective that in some ways is biased. Okay, so I just want to lay that on the table. As you know, I'm from Canada. That informs, what I understand a health system should or does work. What's involved in it. I'm a physician, and so that gives me a particular lens on the healthcare system as well, which is incomplete. And also, whatever perspectives I have, come from what I've learned from, Jeremy Grimshaw, who's my mentor, and others in the field who came before and whose papers I read and so on. So, I just a caveat that I do bring my own biases. I'm not the source of truth for certain, but I hope I can offer something useful here. So here's a picture of Canada. I'm sure you're vaguely familiar. Toronto's down there in the south. And here's a zoomed in photo. You can see that my team and we work at Women's College Hospital down in, basically in the midst of a whole bunch of hospitals. And so we actually have a whole bunch of healthcare professionals and teams and partners that we have the opportunity to work with locally. But generally, we do a lot of our work province-wide. And in fact, Canada doesn't have a single health system. It actually has a health system for each of its provinces. Healthcare is a provincially organized system. So it's a commonly, not well understood that there is no national health system in Canada. Each province has one. And so most of my work is actually in the province of Ontario, which is where Toronto is and where Ottawa is, our national capital. And where, in fact, the bulk of our population lives. All right, so let's begin. A few things just to set the stage. I think, first and foremost, asking the question why we bother using data. And I'm fond of saying that guidelines do not self-implement. If they did, we would all very readily follow the 10 Commandments, and we wouldn't need infrastructures that religions build around those guidelines to help us be the best people we can be. So, guidelines don't self-implement. We need data to know how we're doing and where we need to improve. And one of the reasons we need those data is that all humans, but especially, I would argue, healthcare professionals are very poor at self-assessment. We spent all our life at the top of our class, being told that we're doing great. And then we get out into our practice, and our practice is informed by however we were taught 5, 10, 20, or 30 years ago. And without any data, we're prone to feel dangerously overconfident. And so there is this famous curve, the Dunning-Kruger curve. And I like to call this point on the curve the sort of the Trump point. So this is somebody with very low competence, but very high confidence. And this is the most dangerous kind of healthcare professional. And as they become more of an expert, as they learn more, they start realizing all that they don't know, and their confidence drops. And in fact, over time from there, they start to head towards becoming an expert. And that's why so many academics who actually are legitimate experts frequently answer questions like that you would hope they would be able to provide a straightforward answer to with something wishy-washy, like, oh, well, it depends on the one hand, on the other hand, because academics live somewhere usually around here. They realize what they don't know, and so their confidence is lower. Beware of the physicians who live up here or other healthcare professionals. I wouldn't want my healthcare from somebody like that, somebody who lives there at the Trump point. And so what we really need to move people along is data, is what I would argue. They need to know how they're doing in comparison to their goals, so they can know that they have room for improvement. So is data enough? Does data lead to quality improvement? I think it's worth remembering what happens. Many of you on the call probably have children, or you can remember being a child and getting a report card from school. And maybe there was, a conversation with somebody about that report card. And I think it's really important to remember that when we give a child a report card that reveals some sort of substandard score, maybe an F, as in this picture, we shouldn't just expect the child to know what to do differently or better to improve their grade. And likewise, with healthcare professionals, it's unfair to expect that in all circumstances, simply providing data is enough to lead to quality improvement. This child clearly has the wrong idea of what's expected of him. So there are three categories of obstacles to achieving the optimal possible benefit from audit and feedback that I'd like to talk about. And those fall into category one, being the audit, then the feedback, and then supporting the action that we want them to do. And I'll zero in on a couple categories or topics within each. Within the audit, I want to talk about the data and the partnerships. Within the feedback itself, I want to talk about how the data are perceived. And then within the action category, I want to talk about how we help people to turn the data into something that actually changes processes of care and patient outcomes. Okay, there's a lot of assumptions that go into audit and feedback that I just want to break down here in each of these steps. So let's talk about the data. I hope folks are familiar with this acronym. It means garbage in, garbage out. I think frequently when you give, and I'll probably say this again during this quick talk, when you give clinicians information about their practice, the immediate response will be that the data are no good, and they may be right. And so there are three types of data that I see being used regularly in audit and feedback. One comes from clinical charts. So maybe that's a manual search of charts, or maybe it's an automated search of electronic records. Another is from billing data or administrative data. So these are data collected generally automatically and then used for a secondary purpose of measuring quality of care. And then the third that I frequently see is patient-reported data. And I think there's a lot of room for exploration in this space because I think most of the literature has actually focused on the previous two. And I think, the issue is that with each of these, there are major limitations with what exactly we're hoping them to measure versus what they do measure. And I think it's really important to be cognizant of that. The next thing to talk about, and I think we can circle back about the data for each of the projects, but the next thing to talk about is partnerships. And we've done some thinking and writing about what we call implementation science laboratories. And we see these as foundational infrastructure for moving forward the science of implementation work, and in particular, moving forward the science of how we do audit and feedback. In my experience, getting accurate data in a reliable and sustainable way requires partnerships. And a good partnership is one where the researchers find a way to help the healthcare organization achieve their own mission, while at the same time, the healthcare organization is contributing to scientific progress. And the way that we've tried to enable that is really integrating our partner organizations who in general hold the data into all of our decision-making about what the intervention looks like, our decision-making about what the topics are, our decision-making about how to evaluate it and what the key evaluation questions are. There have been instances where things that we wanted to do were not viable in a sustainable way by our partners. And so we changed course. And, you know, vice versa. I think we've been able to successfully convince our partners that there are important scientific questions that can be embedded in the things that they wanted to do anyways. And the other reason I really want to push the idea of partnership is that if there are health systems responsible for, as an example, reducing inappropriate C-sections, if there are organizations who that's part of their service mission, then there's a greater chance to carry out audit and feedback at scale. And it's only if we have large scale projects that we can ask nuanced, very sort of focused questions about how to optimize the feedback. So there are many advantages to partnerships, and I'm happy to talk about that more, but I'll move on for now. I just want to highlight that in our audit and feedback implementation lab, we've been able to roll out a whole series of randomized trials, asking small questions about how to iteratively and continuously try to make small improvements in the things that our partners wanted to achieve anyways. And we do this across a variety of topics, from antibiotic prescribing to cancer screening to most recently COVID-19 vaccine uptake, asking questions that relate to the different barriers that we're talking about today. However, building those partnerships requires massive amounts of time and investment in relationship building. And this is not the sort of thing that a new investigator is usually rewarded for. You know, I think early on in our careers, we need to typically show impact in traditional ways, you know, more papers in our CV, et cetera. The long-term gains from partnerships that lead to multiple sort of outputs like this really require, in my experience, very active relationship building. And that can be a barrier, finding the time for that. Okay, let's go into the next category. And again, I just want to emphasize that with only 20 minutes, you know, I just want to touch on these things for you, and then we can circle back when and if you have questions. So I really want to focus on how the feedback is perceived for a few moments. And I think it's really important to recognize that when you, as a sort of person interested in data and in quality improvement, produce something that you think will be useful, there are a lot of assumptions that you make about how others will perceive it. And I think it's worth pausing before you go out into the field and testing whether those assumptions are correct. You can see a couple comics here that try to bring that to life. The reality is that when we give feedback, it's frequently, or any kind of data, it's frequently not understood or perceived in the ways that we would have hoped, even with clinicians who we would think are very data literate. They're frequently not. And so, you know, routinely, as I said before with that child, we'll give folks a report card of some sort, and we'll sort of skip the step where we lay out in detail what we want them to understand from that data and how we hope them to respond. We just sort of go from data to quality improvement and haven't thought through the middle piece. And so we actually, you know, led by my colleague and friend Ben Brown out of the University of Manchester, we we spent a lot of time thinking this through and came up with something called the clinical performance feedback intervention sort of theory, CP-FIT. And I just want to focus people's eyeballs at first to the blue box at the bottom. This is the feedback cycle. And I want to highlight that initially when people get feedback, labeled box 3, there's an assumption that they will interact with it. And in fact, for all sorts of reasons, that fourth box may not occur. They may see it as a burden. They may see it as judgmental or scary. And so they may put it aside and deal with it later. And of course, later never comes. Now, even if they do interact with it, there is this often forgotten step 6 of verification. So frequently when you give people, clinicians data, as I said before, they'll respond by saying those data are no good, or I'm not sure I trust those data. And they'll want to dig into their charts to check whether in fact these are correct. And we have to make that a simple process because if that doesn't happen, if we don't enable that or build credibility in the data in some way, we won't get them over to box 7, which is acceptance. If they accept that there is a gap between where they would hope to be in this clinical measure and where they actually are, then we're making an assumption that they will move automatically to some sort of intention to act, to make it better. But in fact, that is an assumption because it might be that they will tolerate, relatively substandard care in that area because they think that area isn't as high priority right now or ever as other things that they're working on. And so it's really important that we understand how they prioritize this issue and how we can influence that. Finally, even if they have an intention to act, it doesn't mean that in box 9, they know how to act. So frequently, I've had the experience where you give data back to clinicians, well-meaning clinicians who want to improve. And if they're in a safe space, they'll say to you something along the lines of, I'd like to do better, but I can't work any harder than I'm already working. In other words, they can't think of any way other than trying harder to improve processes or quality of care in that metric. They don't know how to take on, as we describe it here, organizational level actions. It's just not been in their training, or it doesn't come top of mind to them. And so we have to help them with that. And so that's the feedback cycle there that sort of embeds all these assumptions that we have to overcome if we're going to build feedback properly. The top of the box here talks about the things that might influence those different steps in the feedback cycle. And I won't belabor that at the moment, just because of time. But the takeaway point for this category of feedback and perception is that there are predictable reactions that the clinicians you're trying to make change amongst will have, and we need to consider those and address them specifically. Those predictable reactions are, the data are no good, my patients are different, or I'm not sure how to improve. And if we don't incorporate those responses to those predictable reactions into our feedback, I don't think we'll get our optimal response. I know that you've had a whole talk on Jamie's 15. I think there is, I've argued for a couple of years now, one thing missing from this 15. So, there is room, I think, for further research on a 16th item, which is incorporating the patient perspective. And so I just raised that because it's a potential means of changing how people prioritize this issue that you want them to improve, and how they think about ways to take action on the data you give them. And then one more point about this sort of feedback category is that, if we think really carefully about what our goal is when we give them data, it doesn't just go from data to quality improvement. There's some steps in there that we need to unpack. And our report, our feedback, has to push them through those steps. And those steps ultimately involve some form of cognitive change and then behavior change. We're asking them to change their behavior in some way, shape, or form. That means we should be clear when we're building feedback reports, what behavioral reaction we're hoping the recipient to take, and then incorporate behavior change techniques within the feedback report that will enable that specific response that we're hoping for. Okay, otherwise we're just adding burden to their life. So now a few words about action. So we talked a little bit about the audit and how to make that work, the feedback and the perceptions there, and then the action. And these, of course, all interact. There's been some recent work by friends of ours out in Alberta on this topic that I just want to highlight. This is actually an adaptation of sort of theory from sort of the medical education literature around how we give feedback. And I think feedback as it relates to medical education is a little bit different than clinical performance feedback that comes from an audit. Typically, medical education is a single event and we're giving feedback. And typically, an audit is a summary of performance over time. However, there's stuff that can be adapted, as was done here. And the real emphasis in this sort of work by a group out of Calgary was the potential benefits of discussing the audit results in a group and helping that group identify an action plan and identify the barriers to that action plan and then overcoming those barriers. And I want to emphasize the rationale for this is that a couple things in my mind. One, it almost forces people to interact. Remember that box that we need people to actually engage with the data if we stand any hope of change happening. This actually, forces them to do that. Now, ideally, that's going to happen in a safe space where people are comfortable talking about their data and they're not going to feel judged. Depending on the climate of the team, that may or may not be the case. And so sometimes it's necessary to code the data. And so only the recipient within the group knows which data is theirs and everybody else sees, that it's the performance of person A, person B, and person C, and so on. But in a culture where you can decode the data and identify it clearly and highlight maybe the performance of the person who's doing best, that's likely the culture in which quality improvement can proceed most quickly. I want to just stop for a second, just a bit of a tangent, and recognize that some places and some teams don't have that culture. There is a phrase, there's an idiom, a phrase, a common saying that culture eats strategy for breakfast. So we can think through feedback as beautifully and as much detail as we want, but if the culture is not ready for it, that's a problem. And so we have to address that first. And so we have to make sure that the culture is ready for it by giving people a sense of purpose about why this matters. And that just circles back to what I was saying about point 16, the point that I think was missing from Jamie's 15, and that we need more research on is how to bring in the patient voice so that people feel that this is indeed a high priority thing to improve. Even still, there will be, as Rogers described, some folks that are very keen and some folks that are laggards. And that's okay. It really is. Let's get the improvement where we can. So just want to emphasize a couple of things here as take-home points as it relates to action. It's really important for the recipients to agree that the thing that you're auditing is important and that it's something they can do something about. Secondly, they need to sense that they're getting a fair comparison. So it is typical in an audit to compare to some sort of standard. Frequently, that standard is the average across a region. But perhaps that average will be seen as unfair or undesirable in some way. And so we should think carefully about what the comparison should be. Then we should realize that when we show them that, that they're not doing as well as they might have hoped, they will have some very predictable reactions. Some of those will be negative emotions. They'll often stem from this sense that it's an unfair comparison, the data are no good, my patients are different, or, as I said before, the unstated concern underlying that they're not sure how to do better. And so if we want to help them act to make things better, we need to make them realize that it's not about asking them to try harder. Most of my colleagues are burnt out, and I can't ask them to work harder. I need to ask them to think creatively about changes to processes. And then the moment there's some sort of improvement, we need to celebrate that success. A couple more caveats, and then I'll stop speaking. I think we need to recognize, going back to that concept of the audit and the garbage in, garbage out, that we don't want to improve only on things that are measurable just because they are measurable. There are a whole bunch of other things that matter a lot to my patients that we don't do a good job at measuring. Maybe we should invest in that. But right now we don't. It doesn't mean that I shouldn't try to be more patient-centered, more accessible, just because all we're measuring is whether I, prescribed a statin to my patients. And then for all of you who are leading these initiatives, I think it's really important that you retain your credibility. You don't want to be seen by the people that you're providing feedback to as a manager, which in my experience is a negative term. Instead, you want to be seen as a leader. Somebody who, when there's a problem, they're getting their hands dirty and they're contributing to fixing it. They understand that they can't ask their colleagues to work harder. They want to find a way to help them work smarter. And so this is truly the last slide. I think if we find common ground with our colleagues who are receiving data about our patients and how much we care about the quality of, healthcare that they receive, then we can build up from there. And so there is this sociological sort of, aspect to quality improvement that is often forgotten, that we're in this together, there's solidarity, we all have a shared goal, and it comes from, Donna Bedian would say, love of our patients. And so I think I'll stop there, but I'm happy to belabor or talk more about any of those points.